Welcome back, everyone. This is another Jinxed lecture. I've recorded it thrice now. This is the third time I'm trying. Don't ask me what happened the last couple of times. Once I thought I wasn't teaching well, and the other time I was using slides that were the wrong version at the end of the day. So that's what you get for being online. This is so despite my lack of ability with the camera, this is a fantastic topic, and so I really wanted to take the time to do it properly. And so we'll start with asking a very simple question, which is, why don't Pakistani firms grow? And if you think about that, there are many reasons. You can think of the fact that we have a lack of sort of good public goods being available. We've already talked about the lack of security of life and why that matters, the security of property and why that matters. But there are other answers that have to do with, you guessed it, contracts. And what I want to do today is start by just motivating that question a bit. So why don't Pakistani firms grow? I think if you look at any Pakistani market, such as this one, you'll see that there is a substantial amount of brick and mortar there, but you don't see these firms going beyond the 4 marla or 8 marla storefront that is so common here. And then the question becomes, why is that? Right? Why is it that we have a failure to collectivize and make larger firms? And that is the question that I asked myself as an undergrad back in the day, and one that sort of it took me a few years to get to the answer to, but one that I think is pretty self-evident once you start thinking about it. So, consider a Pakistani sports or toy shop, and in fact, here are 4 or 5 in the same plaza, as opposed to which you could go to England and you'll have, for nearly the same sort of resources being input, you'll have a larger chain. So this is JD Sports. It's a sports chain across England, and as you can see, they're nearly the same physically, but they're very different in terms of how they're organized. JD is organized not just at this store level, but at a much larger level. I don't know how many, but tens or hundreds of storefronts, all combined in terms of having the same advertising, the same branding, the same procurement. So when they want to buy, let's say, these shoes that they're displaying at the storefront here, they'll have gone and ordered for across their many stores, and that means that they'll get better rates from the suppliers. As opposed to which, these firms in Pakistan have much smaller storefronts. And so it's not a question of resource or poverty, it's a question of what is it that allows capital or resources to be collectivized in one country and not be collectivized elsewhere. So if you think about these storefronts next to one another, imagine if they were able to sit down together and say, let's break down the walls between our shops. That will free up literally floor space. And then they'll come around and say, well, why should we display the same item in all of these stores? Let's just display the item once and keep the rest of our stock in the back rooms. And then they'll say, let's have a common billboard that is larger and more attractive so that our customers are attracted more. And so on and so forth. And very quickly you start seeing that there are economies of scale from doing what JD has done and creating this sort of a combined firm or a combined effort. And of course, when you start thinking about it, in the rural sector, we talked about this slide in the last class of this farm in Illinois versus this farm in Pakistan. Both of these, of course, are Google images. And I said that the lack of a good property system is what causes you to not be able to collectivize your efforts in farming. But if you think about it, it's not just property, but it's also your ability to contract that matters. So assume, and there are places in Pakistan where there is clean title, and this problem that we just talked about in the last class isn't really a problem. But it's not just title, it is contract, right? So if I write a contract with you saying I'm going to lend you my land to add to your combined collective farming that you're doing, and in return you'll give me a certain amount at the end of each year. And suppose that you take my land and start cultivating, you cultivate and then you run away with the produce without paying me anything. What recourse do I have? Even though there's no dispute about the fact that I own the property, our contract, or the lack of the contract, is what has really hurt me or not given me an opportunity to get redress. And so it is both good property title and the ability to contract around not just property but other things such as effort that unlock a lot of sort of trapped economic value in your economy. As I said in the last class, a farmer working on a modern farm can produce as much output using as much land as 45 men on a low capacity one. And that statistic comes from a study from 2014 by Doug Colin and his co-authors. And so think of the tremendous potential, economic potential that we are leaving untapped, right? It's a very significant thing. Now, if we had not just, you could fix this problem with land reform and you could forcibly take from some people and give to others. But instead of that, if what you did was just ensured good property titling, and then as Chris Woodruff had pointed out in the quote that we discussed in the last class, a good judicial system that enforces contracts, you'll get most of the way through. In Pakistan, it's quite unheard of, with one or two salient exceptions such as Jahangir Tareen, who has done this exercise of collecting people's land and giving them rent and creating a much larger operation that is able to tap far more economies of scale. But that is a very, it's the rare Pakistani entrepreneur that has the ability to produce that parcel with our current sort of institutional setup and legal situation, if you will. And so if you look at the distribution of farm area by tenure, so here what we're seeing is that on your x-axis are different sizes of farms, and then you've got your farm area that's cultivated but distributed by whether it is the tenant, an owner come tenant, or an owner purely who is cultivating the land, right? Owner come tenant means both of them are, there's an owner who is also cultivating but also giving some landers to thekedars, right? Or palledars, they're called, the tenants. And why is that, right? There is principle of good economic management that you want to de-link ownership from control or ownership from management. Why is that? Because ownership can be hereditary. It can come about because you did something valuable before and then you bought, right? So you made your money in professionally and then you buy a store, for example. It doesn't mean that you are the best person to run that that industry or that firm. And if you're not the best person to run that firm, it might be that you are willing to trade with, for example, the person next door who is actually better at these things in order to get sort of more out of the land or more out of the firm or whatever else it is that you were talking about. So to be able to de-link ownership from control, you need to give the owner a surety that if they're not there day to day, the firm or the farm or whatever else, the economic activity with their resource will be done with their best interest in mind. And for that to happen, we have to unlock profit maximization. They have to know that profit maximization will make sense for the person who is going to use their farm or going to run their business, but it's not profit maximization of the theft variety that we talked about in the previous class, but instead profit maximization where they can trust their tenant or their manager in the firm to bring back a good sizable share of that for them to use. Right? So again, keep in mind the good principle of management that ownership should be de-linked from control. In this case, what we're seeing is that mostly owners are cultivating themselves. And when owners are cultivating themselves, we're saying it's very likely, this is a very strong symptom that we are not using the land in the best managerial way, in the best way managerially. Okay, so this is trying to understand how to unlock this latent potential is the topic of today's class on the security of contracts. So to formalize this idea of contracting and what the value of that, let's start by thinking about a very important game in game theory called the agency or trust game, which is the situation of an investor who decides to invest an amount with an entrepreneur, and that entrepreneur can either cooperate or appropriate that money. If so, let's say that investor has given $1 as an investment to the entrepreneur. If the entrepreneur uses that dollar productively, they can create another dollar of value. And if they appropriate, they'll just run away without using that dollar, right? So if they appropriate, the investor gets -1, they're out of pocket the $1 that they had given the entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur gains that dollar. And so payoffs in games in the extensive form as we're showing it here are written with the following methodology. We always keep the payoff of the person who appears first in the game, in this case the investor, on the leftmost side, followed by every subsequent person to the right. So in this case, the person on the left is the investor, the person on the right is the entrepreneur. And as opposed to this, if the entrepreneur cooperates, he took that $1 in trust, right, and use that to create a new dollar. That new dollar is shared production where the capital of the investor was used and the labor of the entrepreneur was used, or the risk-taking ability of the entrepreneur was used. And so that new dollar is divided 50-50, and the entrepreneur returns the original dollar as well as 50% of the new dollar that's created. So for net income for both of them of $0.50 each. Now, one of the principles of game theory, especially written out in this form, the extensive form, is that you apply what is called backward induction, or the idea that you start by thinking about the last decision that's made and what that person will do, and use that to think ahead from the perspective of the original player, in this case the investor. So how do you do that? Here, if you give the entrepreneur the choice between cooperating and appropriating, and assuming that he's only looking after his own profit, well, $1 is greater than $0.50, and so he will always appropriate or steal the investor's original dollar. Which means that facing these decisions, you can cut out the corporate branch entirely, and you can even rub out the name of the entrepreneur, and the investor knows that if he invests, money will always be appropriated and he will always lose the $1. And so what he does is he says, I don't want to invest, and we'll stick with the status quo, right? So what we've done is we've first looked at the last person's decision making, figured out the decision that they will take, and then use that to reach the rational decision for the original player. And so if the investor invests, he knows the entrepreneur will appropriate, so the investor doesn't invest in the first place. Now the problem here is not that there isn't a productive outcome to be had. The problem is that the entrepreneur can't make a credible commitment to not run away with the money. The fact that the entrepreneur can't be trusted doesn't only hurt the investor, it also hurts the entrepreneur, because now he can't access that credit. So if you gave the entrepreneur the option before the game started to delete the option of appropriating, the entrepreneur would delete it. Ex ante, before the game starts, the entrepreneur doesn't want to appropriate. Once the game starts and the entrepreneur is standing with that dollar in their hand, they should run away with it, right? Logically. But you have to understand that the ex post or the decision making process, what is rational once the game starts, is not necessarily what is rational for the same person beforehand. In this case, the entrepreneur who will want to appropriate if the investor invests would love to delete the opportunity to appropriate if the investor, if there was something that he could do to cut that branch off before the investor reached their decision, because that will change the investor's decision. A credible commitment will make the investor invest. A lack of credible commitment will not make the entrepreneur invest, will not make the investor invest, I'm sorry. So we'll demonstrate how contracts can fix this problem in a minute, but let's look at some of the context in which this happens. First, investing in a company controlled by managers, right? You go to the stock market and there are people who are running a firm without their own money, with other people's money, that is the stockholder. How can we trust the managers to run it for profit and not for their own luxuries or on their own whim? We could, if the managers can write a contract or create other institutional structure that forces them to behave on the profit motive. Second, in hiring a worker, let's say that you decide to hire somebody and you have to entrust them with money. How do you know they're not going to run away with money? Same sort of scenario. And finally, if you're giving a cash advance, as a lot of businesses run on credit, and so if you're giving an advance of goods or cash to one party, how do you know they're not going to run away with that money? All of these problems can be solved with contracts, and it's whether or not it will be solved, whether or not we'll be able to reach that level of trust depends on the ability to contract. So how do contracts solve the agency game? So let's go back to the same structure as before, and remember that if the entrepreneur appropriates the initial investment, because that was not what was agreed upon, if you can formalize this legally, you can say there is a breach of contract, right? Running away with the money would now constitute a breach of contract. The law then requires him or her to not only return the initial investment, but also compensate the investor for the lost profit opportunity, which is one of the ways in which damages are calculated. Damages legally are the amount of money that someone who has hurt another person's interests, legal interests, compensates that party. So legally, think about it this way. What the entrepreneur has done is, if you think of the entrepreneur's choice legally, he is either going to perform the contract agreed upon, which is give me $1 and I'll make another dollar and give you half of it, or the entrepreneur is going to breach that contract. Once he decides to breach the contract, if he performs, they both get half-half. If he decides to breach the contract, a legal system that is well enforced will force the entrepreneur to give the investor not just the money that he was trying to run away with, so that, starting from -1 to the investor and 1 to the entrepreneur without the law being implemented, the first thing the law will do is force him to give that money back. So they'll be back to 0-0. But additionally, the law will say, because you had agreed to a contract that said I'll use that money and make $0.50 for you, and you fail to do that, you now owe the investor an additional 0.5, and this will cause the payoff to change as follows. Now the investor is going to get 0.5 and the entrepreneur is getting minus 0.5. And this simple act, what does that do in the game? So now imagine we were restarting to think about the trust game or the agency game with these payoffs that you see on the screen now. Now the entrepreneur has a choice between making 0.5 by performing the contract or having to pay 0.5 out of pocket if he doesn't perform the contract, right? So now he says, well, no, I don't want to breach the contract. The entrepreneur always performs. And knowing this, the investor knows that he has a choice between not investing and earning $0 and investing $1 that he will get back plus 0.5. If you look at the payoff, the leftmost payoff is the investor's payoff when the entrepreneur performs is 0.5. So now the investor is really choosing between 0.5 in that scenario and not investing or $0, and will pick investing because he knows, he's confident that the entrepreneur will choose to perform, and given this, he knows that he'll make more money by investing. So we've just talked about how trade is enabled or improved by the ability of the parties to create a contract. But why is trade still possible? And why is trade regularly engaged in without formal contract, even in strong legal systems? And why is it still able to function in systems without a strong legal framework? So to think about this, let's think about first the fact that there is formal but instantaneous exchange, right? So you go to buy groceries, or you go to buy a new shirt, you go to do all sorts of retail shopping, and you can do that without a contract because A, the item is usually small enough that a contract is not merited, and B, there's no trust required because you can trade the item immediately. Imagine that you were buying something expensive like a laptop, say, and you went and gave them the money and they didn't give you the laptop. Even then you are protected by their reputation, because as soon as they don't hand you over the laptop, presumably a laptop retailer is a large business, and the fact that they did something like that will damage their reputation enough to hurt their business, and so they wouldn't want to do that. And this is how we trade all the time. You and I trade in, again, a legal system with huge case backlogs, unfortunately, but we're able to trade and lead a normal life in large part because the stakes are not very high. And then you can also have even larger transactions happen in countries such as ours in informal exchange. And how does that work? So first, an example of this is when, so in the US, rural US, there is this custom or culture in some places of contributing to barn raisings. When someone wants to build a barn, their neighbors feel a social obligation to go and contribute their time and labor to that effort, because they know that if they contribute today, their neighbor who is now obliged will come and help them out in the future. So some of this cultural or social gifting happens because of this idea of reciprocity, the fact that generally if I take care of this person, they'll take care of me later. This is abstracting completely from morality and any concept of wanting to do good for your neighbor inherently. Unfortunately, we don't have enough of a framework there, but even in terms of your narrow incentives, it can make sense to cooperate in this way. Another example of informal exchange is microfinance. So Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, sort of Muhammad Yunus came up with this idea of social collateral. So the bank would give loans where the loan would not be collateralized with property, as we discussed in a previous class, but instead through social obligations. So in other words, if you were given the loan, your paying the loan back would be linked with whether your neighbor got the loan next week. And so the fact that their interests are also on the line is what will help create this incentive for you to pay your loan back. Now, keep in mind that in all of this informal exchange, in all of these examples of informal exchange, the reason that it happens is that the interactions are repeated. In the barn raising, if someone asks you to help them raise their barn and there were no barns to be constructed after that, well, you might not be willing to help. And in case of microfinance, if you're the last person taking the loan, it might be that you're not willing to pay the loan back after that. So more generally, informal exchange works through reciprocity, at least in large part through reciprocity, and that reciprocity is further enabled by repetition. Why does repetition work? So go back to the agency game, but in this case, think of the game as we've discussed it so far as the stage game. One player investing once and one player deciding to cooperate once. This snapshot, imagine that we repeat it multiple times. So the same player 1 and player 2, but they're investing and cooperating multiple times. So now assume that if repeated, the promisee, that is the investor or player 1 now, as I'm calling him, the promisee invests in the next period if the promisor cooperated this period and does not invest for 2 periods as a form of punishment otherwise. Right? That is the strategy. Investor 1 and player 1 or the investor will always follow this strategy, and player 2 knows this. Well, then the alternatives available to the player 2 or the entrepreneur or the promisor are either cooperate and get 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, and so on, or appropriate and get 100, 100, and so on. Now it's plain to see that whether the promisor decides to appropriate or cooperate depends on how much they value the first dollar compared to future payoffs. If there is no discount rate being used, imagine that they value this income stream equally, there's no inflation, there's no sense of time preference, then it's a pretty clear win for cooperating, right? Because you get 1.5 in 3 time periods versus just 1 by appropriating. But on the other hand, assume that there is extreme inflation, so you're discounting for other reasons to an extreme, so that what you earn this time period is important, but the future doesn't really matter to you. In that case, appropriating might be more important. Okay? And so think about the fable about the goose that lay the golden egg, which is told to us to sort of suggest the generally correct principle that we should not be myopic or impatient. Well, if the person owning the goose was dying on an island and was going to be rescued the next day, well, slaying the goose does make sense, right? It's all about the discount rate. And pulling back from this game and thinking about it, if I run away with an investor's money and I know that they're not going to cooperate with me in the future, assuming normal interest rates and normal time preferences, I will feel the cost of running away with their money in the future, which I shouldn't do, and therefore I'm less likely to run away with that money. So the agency game repeated is more likely to create a cooperation solution than an appropriating one. Stable partnerships are marked by a lack of appropriation, We've already talked about the microfinance example. Also in Faisalabad, in the textile market in Faisalabad, there are handwritten promissory notes. So saying, I owe you 20 lakh rupees, that, or 1 crore rupees, that people will, if they don't have cash at the moment, they'll write on a scrap piece of paper, sign it, and then that note is used nearly like currency in that market. Why is it used as currency? Why shouldn't someone write, I owe you 3 crore rupees, take the money and run? Well, you and I might run with that money, but the reason that that person won't run is because if they run, their business in that industry they'll be ostracized out of that business. And so as long as you're around and this is a stable player in the market, this sort of repeated trust can still be enabled. There are limits to informal exchange though. So one is that you need to trade with known parties, because in a normal market what you do is go and trade with the party that you know will give you the best rate. But if you've ever bought like a smartphone, let's say, or a printer or something or a car, let's say, you will often take a less good deal when you know that the party that you're trading with is reliable. So this is problematic in the sense that if everyone was reliable, you'd go and get the item from the person charging the best rate. And so the fact that you have to trade with a known party that you have a relationship with perhaps hampers the ability to extract the most economic efficiency out of a system. Also, there's something called end game degeneracy. Near the end of a relationship, this idea that future punishment, that my running away with the money today will cause future punishment, is less important to people, right? So relationships can start breaking down. So as we conclude this discussion of contracts, I'm reminded of this quote from Adam Smith. Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. All the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. So what Smith is saying is that you need peace and a tolerable administration of justice, that is security of life, property and contract, and as well as easy taxes. And then you're good. That is economics in one sentence. He's being a little bit inaccurate, because you need to worry about all sorts of other things, such as market structure is very important, whether you have competition or monopolistic seller or buyer. Things like information, which we'll talk about next time, is very important. And then as an economy, you need to worry about the size and the efficiency of your public sector, which is a tremendously important subject in its own right. But having said that, I think Smith's emphasis on peace and a tolerable administration of justice is really important. And unfortunately, this is always, when I go and discuss economics with policymakers, the biggest sticking point for me, that I'm often asked to suggest economic policies without any seeming investment of energy in peace and justice. And the economy is largely a non-starter without this. So let's look at where we stand. So this is the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index that they come out with every year or every other year. And China, I'm going to compare with China and India. China is doing pretty well on order and security. The overall statistic is something else. I'm just focusing on the order and security part of the results this year. India is pretty bad, and Pakistan, unfortunately, is abysmal on the indicator of order and security generally. Then you've got whether crime is effectively controlled, and China is doing very well. India is also doing very well, and Pakistan is significantly less so. Both India and China are doing better than the global average, whereas Pakistan is doing significantly worse than the global average, unfortunately. And finally, whether civil conflict, whether civil conflict is effectively limited. China has limited civil conflict quite a bit, in part by being draconian. India has limited it in most places, but not in places like Kashmir, so it gets a middling sort of score, and below the global average. And Pakistan, of course, because of our history with terrorism and other conflicts in the last couple of decades, gets a very bad rate. I actually have my own research in this area, and we can demonstrate that civil conflict has certainly decreased, as I'm sure all of us have experienced. So we are doing better than, perhaps, I would say we're doing probably better than this statistic suggests, or this indicator suggests, but it's pretty bad, right? And finally, do people resort to violence to settle grievances or disputes? This is a measure of how much people rely on your legal dispute resolution system, the justice system. And in China, again, they're doing reasonable. They're not doing great, but they're okay, less than many developed countries. India is doing worse even than the region. And in this case, Pakistan is doing just slightly better than India, but neither of us have anything to write home about. The gist of this is that we lack both law and order and security on the streets, and also a justice system that is willing and able to settle problems and disputes when they arise. And as I've tried to demonstrate throughout these 3 lectures or 4 lectures, settling disputes properly and in the right way, for the right person, in favor of the right person, is incredibly important for the economy. I'll repeat, you cannot improve your economy and structure your economy well without paying due attention to law and order. There are things you can do to improve the economy even while you're making improvements here, such as to break down the sort of monopolies in your economy by improving education and other things. But ultimately, the rule of law is a first order fundamental issue to be fixed. Way more important, I believe, than bribery and corruption. I teach a class on corruption, and I'm happy to chat to you outside, maybe in the comment section here or by email about this. But I'm quite confident that the evidence suggests that a focus on the rule of law is far more important than anti-corruption for a country's growth. So with that, we conclude this module on the institutional underpinnings, specifically of the legal underpinnings of the economy. Again, first order, very important determinant of how well your economy does. But as you'll see in the next few classes, there's a lot more to it, and I look forward to talking to you about it shortly. Take care. Khuda Hafiz.